The endocrine system, as you can tell, is pretty darn amazing and pretty darn complex. I've only talked about a fraction of the hormones that actually exist within the human body and that actually function in this elaborate dance to maintain homeostasis and to keep us healthy. And so it should not be surprising to know that sometimes these endocrine systems don't work as perfectly as we might like. And when homeostasis is lost and cannot be restored, we then end up with a pathology or a disease. Pathologies involving endocrine hormones are somewhat common. I don't have any statistics for you, but they're certainly not unheard of. And we're going to talk about some of the more common types of pathology, only a small handful of them. There are certainly a lot more. The thing with pathologies for the endocrine tissue is one of the other problems that we're faced with is that endocrine tissue is epithelial tissue, and epithelial tissue tends to be rapidly dividing, which means we're replacing our epithelial tissue fairly quickly. Some are outrageously fast, such as in the digestive system, where we replace the digestive lining quickly, extremely quickly. But in other situations, it's a little more slow. Nevertheless, anytime you have cells that are rapidly dividing, they are at greater risk of developing mutations that could lead to cancer. And so sometimes our endocrine pathologies are due to tumors that are formed that spontaneously begin secreting hormones outside of the normal homeostatic regulatory processes. Sometimes, on the other hand, we have lesions that occur because of perhaps trauma of some sort. Maybe a traumatic brain injury might cause lesions in the hypothalamus or the pituitary, or perhaps some other disease could cause these lesions, or other conditions. And so once those occur, sometimes that will result in a loss of function of these endocrine diseases or endocrine glands, and so we can have problematics with that. In some cases, we actually can have an autoimmune disease where our own immune system will attack our endocrine glands. And so each of these things, and probably many different other types of insults, can cause damage, and they can lead to a loss of homeostasis because the gland is not functioning correctly. Regardless of how it works, we can group endocrine disorders into three basic types. Hyposecretion means the secretion of too little hormone. So for whatever reason, that endocrine gland is not making enough hormone, and it could be because it's been damaged. It could be because maybe we're missing an ingredient. For example, if we don't have enough iodine, we can't make thyroid hormones. T3 and T4 both rely on iodine being present in our diet, and without it, we can't make it. And so various issues can lead to hyposecretion, too little secretion of a hormone. On the other hand, hypersecretion occurs when too much hormone is being released. And again, we can see this for a variety of reasons, but one of the most common is probably a tumor or a growth or a neoplasia. Neoplasia simply means new growth, that secretes excess hormone and is outside of the normal regulatory processes, so it doesn't respond to negative feedback. It's just going to march to its own drum. It's going to do its own thing. And another method has to do with receptors. So remember, in each of these examples of hormones that I've given you, I've tried to really emphasize these homeostatic pathways of how stimuli activates a receptor, which activates a cell signaling cascade, which activates the release of a hormone. And if in any of those signal transduction pathways, if any of those are damaged or out of whack, we can get mismanagement of that hormone release. We could get, in this case, I have listed receptor desensitization, and that simply means the receptor stops working. Or the second messengers stop working. Is we could have a receptor that's working perfectly fine, but if the second messengers downstream are offline, then the signal's not being processed by the cell. And so those are each examples or situations where we could have a change in hormone production because of those types of disorders. Now, roughly speaking, so we've got hyposecretion, hypersecretion, receptor desensitization, cell signaling malfunction, but we can actually divide these types of malfunctions into what we call primary disorders and secondary disorders. Now, I want you to remember that I talked about, so even though we have our integrating centers, let's see here. I need a place to draw. I'll draw right up here. So even though I mentioned we're going to have my integrating center 1, which often is the hypothalamus, okay, and that's going to release my releasing hormone, and then I'm going to have my my regulatory hormone center 2, and that's usually the pituitary, and I'm going to release my pituitary hormone, so anterior pituitary hormone in this example. And then usually I have another gland, some kind of other gland, okay, which would be my integrating center 3, okay, and then that's going to release another hormone, and that's going to hit our target tissue. And this hormone might also, in addition, suppress the release of that hormone, or this hormone could suppress the release of the regulatory hormone, or in some way be involved in this negative feedback process. Now, this last gland is called the primary gland. It kind of bugs people because you're like, wait, that's integrating center 3, so how can number 3 be the primary gland? But it's called the primary gland because it's the one that actually gets the response. This hormone here is the one that actually generates the response from the target tissue. Okay, that's the one that response. And so you can actually think of this as the target tissue is our effector tissue, and so this hormone that affects the effector tissue, the gland that releases it, is primary. Okay. Any endocrine disorder that affects this primary gland is called a primary disorder. Any tissue that does not, or any endocrine disorder that does not affect that primary gland, whether it's the pituitary or whether it is the hypothalamus, that is called a secondary disorder. Okay. Hopefully that's clear. And then if you look at these disorders, and one of the reasons I've emphasized these cell signal transduction pathways is we can actually, with a little bit of detective work, sometimes we can figure out where the problem is. We can figure out whether we've got a malfunctioning pituitary, whether we've got a malfunctioning hypothalamus, whether we have a malfunctioning primary gland. And so it does take detective work, and sometimes it is dependent on the tools that are available to research, to the medical world. We don't always have the right tools, so we can't always do this. But if you imagine, for example, let's do a little bit of playing a little bit of what if. So let's imagine I'm going to draw a little square that's going to represent my hypothalamus. So this is my hypothalamus. And now I'm going to draw this little upside down heart kind of thing that's going to represent my pituitary, with this being the anterior pituitary. And then let's pick the thyroid, because thyroid disorders are actually somewhat common. So I'm going to draw myself a little butterfly-like structure that is supposed to be my thyroid. Okay. So now somebody comes to the doctor and they're showing all of the symptoms of hypothyroidism. So hyposecretion of thyroid hormone. They're just not making enough. So if we look at the thyroid gland, it's going to be releasing this T3 and T4, and then that of course is going to be affecting my cells of the body. And if you remember back to what thyroid hormone is going to do, you can kind of predict what the symptoms of hypothyroidism would be. So that we would have, low energy levels because we're not making enough ATP. We wouldn't be making protein as well. And so we're going to have, damage to our proteins within our cell. Heart rate will be slow and so forth. And so you can go back and look at that list and make some predictions on this. And so I'm going to write in here, so the doctor's going to do some blood work. You're feeling like crap, that's the first thing they do, is send you to the labs to get blood work done. And the doctor is going to ask for a thyroid panel, and they're going to see, low, outside of normal ranges, which we can do a quick sketch like I tend to do. If my set point is right here, my normal range would be, anything within this particular range here. So we've got a high and a low that are acceptable. But if I'm outside that normal range, if I'm down here, so the blood test says, your thyroid levels are here, I'm hypothyroid. Okay, that's what we would call it. We would have hyposecretion of the thyroid hormone. And that's going to cause some problems for us in terms of homeostasis is lost, and we're not going to feel good. We're not going to feel good at all. So the thing is, though, at this point, all the doctor really knows is that T3 and T4 are low. Okay, that's what the doctor knows. But they don't know why it's low. It might be that the thyroid is not working correctly, and T3 and T4 are low. But thinking about the pathway, let's kind of look at that pathway. What controls the release of thyroid hormone? And the answer you should be saying is, TSHs. Okay, TSHs. What if my TSH is low? If my TSH is low, would that cause low thyroid hormone to be produced? Of course it would. Of course it would. And then how is TSH controlled? Well, TSH is regulated by our thyrotropin releasing hormone, my TRH. What if TRH is low? If TRH is low, then TSH would also be low, right? And if TSH is low, then my thyroid hormone is low. So I have three possible tissues that could be at fault for this. I could have my two secondary tissues. Let's color them in. My secondary tissues are going to be yellow. And then I could have my primary tissue. And any of these tissues could be at fault. Maybe I have a thyroid hormone or thyroid gland that's damaged. Maybe I have an anterior pituitary that's damaged. Maybe my hypothalamus is damaged. We don't know without further blood testing. So not only would the doctor need to do a blood test for T3, but he'd need to do a test to measure TSH as well. And so maybe if our TSH, let's just think about this. Let's go ahead and assume, here's my TSH, and we'll say this is my set point. And of course, we're going to have a normal range, right? So there's my normal range. And if my normal range, if my values happen to be, so my blood test comes in and I'm right here, I'm in a normal range, aren't I? So TSA is normal. Okay, TSA is normal. In this what if scenario, normal. Okay. Or maybe it's not normal. Let's make it, we're going to say normal to high. Okay? Normal to high. Okay, so maybe we have it instead of right there. Maybe my TSH is a little on the high side. Maybe I'm right here. Okay. And let's look at my hypothalamus. So we're going to have to do something to figure out the TRH as well. That's going to have its set point. Just like before. And maybe my TRH is also high. So these are my results of the lab work that we're going to do. So now let's look at this and see if we can do a little detective work and think about this, okay? So, TSH is high. Under normal circumstances, if my TSH is higher than normal, TRH would command my anterior to pituitary to produce TSH, and it would command my anterior pituitary to produce more TSH than is normal, right? If I keep stimulating my anterior pituitary and I'm saying, hey, make TSH, it's going to make more. Now, if I was a healthy person, when my anterior pituitary says, all right, let's make some more TSH than is normal, the thyroid should respond by making more T3 and T4. But in this example, did it? No, it made less. Let's look at the feedback process before we finalize our answer here. T4 and T3, of course, act on the cells of the body, but they're also going to feed back to regulate the release of TRH. Now, so remember, this is foot on the brakes and foot on the gas. And so just to kind of help you understand this negative feedback, when T4 and T3 levels are high, they inhibit the release of TRH. Okay, so they're stomping high, a lot. T3 is what puts the brakes on. T4 is what puts the brakes on. But in the absence or less T4, T3, the inhibition is removed. Okay? This is why it's so important to understand these feedback processes and understand them well. Right? So based on this, let's look at this. I have less T3 and T4, which means these brakes are gone. And so of course I'm going to make more TRH. My hypothalamus is behaving exactly as I would expect it to behave. And if TRH is being produced in abundance, then of course I'm going to make TSH. So my anterior pituitary is behaving exactly as I would expect it to behave. In response to TSH, my thyroid should be making thyroid hormone, but it's not. So here's my problem. I have a primary endocrine disorder in this situation. Let's look at another example. Okay, we're going to do it again. So I'm going to draw. I tend to draw things this way. Okay, so here's my hypothalamus. Here's my pituitary. And this time let's do the adrenal cortex. So here's my adrenal gland with my adrenal medulla, like so. Okay. All right. So now somebody's walking in, they're feeling not so great, and they're showing signs of excess cortisol. So their cortisol levels are high. Higher than normal. Blood test reveals that. So all the symptoms point to that. The doctor runs some blood tests, and sure enough, if we're going to compare it to a chart, we would have my set point. Maybe this is normal right here, and maybe this is my normal range right here, and maybe my cortisol levels is actually we're going to say right there, higher than normal. And so we look at this, and let's put my feedback pathway in. So we're going to assume that cortisol is going to suppress the release of CRH from the hypothalamus. Of course, CRH from the hypothalamus is going to control the release of ACTH from the pituitary. Okay. So with cortisol higher than normal, I would expect my CRH to be lower than normal. And let's go ahead and say we do our blood work. Okay. I'm going to do my blood work for my CRH. Here's my set point. Here's my range. It's not a very big range. There's my range. And my cortisol releasing hormone levels are lower than normal. Now ask yourself, think about this, is that expected? Go back to your negative feedback and let's kind of think it through. When cortisol levels are high, that suppresses the release of CRH, right? High levels of cortisol means we're stomping on the brakes. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Low levels of cortisol and I mean by lower than normal, outside the normal acceptable range. Low levels of cortisol allow the release of of CRH. So in this situation, would it be appropriate for CRH to be low? Lower than normal? And the answer is yes, it would, because we're right here. My cortisol levels are higher than normal, so I've slammed on that brake. So of course the hypothalamus, assuming the hypothalamus is healthy, the hypothalamus is going to respond by saying, oh, whoa, we've got too much cortisol, less CRH. That's what we're going to do. But now we're going to get down to the pituitary, and let's assume that our pituitary, we do our little blood test, or we do our little scientific discovery. And by the way, there's not blood tests for each of these. Sometimes you have to get at it from kind of a backward route, but I don't want to get into how that's done. But just be aware that sometimes we don't always have the tools we want. And now we're going to have something that looks like this. So, that's kind of interesting. If my cortisol levels, if my CRH levels were low, so low CRH levels, my ACTH levels, should they be high or should they be low? I'm hoping you answered they should be low, because CRH controls the release of ACTH. So if I don't have CRH, I'm not going to be producing much CTH. Haha. But it's actually high. So here's my abnormality? Anomaly? Yeah, that's what I'll say. This is my anomaly. It's high. It should be low. It should be low in response to the low CRH, but it's not. It's high. Now let's look at cortisol. If ACTH is abnormally high, should my cortisol levels be high or low? Remember, ACTH commands the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. So, yeah, my cortisol levels should be high. This is responding appropriately in terms of, the pituitary is in command. Think about it, this is a chain of command here. Your superior officers. Okay? And so cortisol is obeying the superior officer, which is the anterior pituitary. But the anterior pituitary is disobeying the anterior pituitary's superior officer. So where's the problem in the chain of command? Well, it's right here. And so this would be called a secondary endocrine disorder. And I would bet money the doctor would see this and say, oh, okay, we're going to need to do a CAT scan. We're going to need to do an MRI maybe. And we're going to find a tumor on that pituitary, probably for sure. We're going to have this little tumor growth. And that little tumor growth is going to be like, haha, I'm making pituitary, I'm making ACTH. I don't care what you say. I'm just going to make as much as I want. Because that's what cancer does. They don't listen. And so treatment might be to carve out that pituitary tumor. But unfortunately, you're also going to be taking out some healthy tissue when you do that. And so the anterior pituitary might not function as well as it normally does. Still, could possibly be a life-saving operation. Okay, so that's essentially how it works, and that's actually the power of understanding these pathways. Is you can do some detective work and deductive reasoning, and you can figure this out, and you can be like, haha, I get it. This is what's wrong. I need to look for the tumor on the pituitary. I need to look for a lesion in the hypothalamus. I need to look for damage to the adrenal cortex or to the thyroid. That's what I need to do. By the way, the thyroid is commonly damaged by radiation, which is why if you go and get x-rays, they'll put a neck shield on you if they're x-raying like your chest or something. Okay. They protect the gonads and they protect the thyroid gland, and so forth. And so that's the basics of how we classify endocrine disorders. We'll next take a look at some of the common endocrine disorders.